Most gardeners think the problem starts when the leaves begin curling in the heat. That is what I used to think too. If the tomatoes looked tired by late afternoon, I blamed the sun. If peppers stalled out halfway through summer, I blamed the weather. And if a transplant sat there for 2 weeks doing absolutely nothing, I usually assumed the roots just needed time. But toward the end of last season, something happened that kept bothering me long after the beds were cleaned out. I was pulling old tomato plants before the first cold nights moved in. One plant came out easily, barely any resistance at all. The roots were thin, shallow, almost disappointing for a plant that had looked fairly healthy from above. Then, I grabbed the next one. That plant did not want to leave the ground. The roots held the soil together in one dense, heavy clump. Thick white branching roots wrapped through the dirt in every direction. I actually had to stop and pull again with both hands because the base would not release cleanly. The strange part was those two plants came from the same seed packet, Samabet, same watering schedule, same summer heat. At first, I thought maybe one had simply found a richer pocket of compost underground. Gardens do that sometimes. Nature is uneven even when we try to make everything perfect. But after looking more closely, I realized there had been one small difference during the season. A few times that summer, I had poured a homemade mixture around one side of the bed after hearing an older gardener mention it casually at a plant swap. No fancy bottle, no expensive garden product, just something from the kitchen that cost less than $1. And honestly, I did not expect much from it. That is probably why I kept thinking about it, because the difference underground looked far bigger than it should have. Researchers eventually started measuring this kind of thing too. But long before studies showed up, gardeners were already noticing certain plants recovering faster after heat, holding moisture better, and surviving rough weather differently, even when everything above the soil looked almost identical. The odd part is most people never pay attention to the roots long enough to notice the pattern. If this kind of slow, practical gardening observation is what you enjoy around here, you are in the right place. Because this entire story starts underground, where almost nobody looks carefully enough. The truth is, most gardening problems begin long before the leaves warn you. For years, I focused almost entirely on what I could see above the soil. Bigger leaves meant success. More flowers meant success. Taller plants meant success. A lot of gardeners think that way because it feels logical. The visible part of the plant becomes the scoreboard, but eventually the garden starts humbling you. You can fertilize heavily and still end up with weak harvests. You can water constantly and still watch plants collapse during a heat wave. You can grow beautiful green foliage only to find the roots underneath barely developed at all. That was a hard lesson for me because I honestly thought I was helping. One summer, I kept feeding a row of tomatoes every week, trying to push more growth before August heat arrived. The plants became huge above ground, dark green leaves everywhere. From a distance, they looked incredible. Then a stretch of brutal dry weather rolled in. Within days, several plants folded, leaves curled upward, fruit stalled out, entire branches wilted by mid-afternoon, even though the soil surface still looked damp. At first, I blamed the temperature. Then I blamed inconsistent watering. Looking back, the real problem had been building quietly, underground, the entire time. The roots were shallow. The plants had been trained to live near the surface, where water and fertilizer always arrived easily. They never had much reason to stretch deeper into cooler soil. That was the season I started paying closer attention to what was happening underneath, instead of chasing whatever product promised greener leaves on the label. And the strange thing is, once you start looking at roots, a lot of confusing garden problems begin making more sense. Transplants that never really take off, cucumbers that suddenly collapse after producing well for weeks, pepper plants that stay alive but never seem vigorous, tomatoes that grow fast early in the season and then completely stall once the weather turns rough. A lot of those problems are connected to what happened below the surface first. Strong roots change everything. They help plants handle inconsistent watering. They help during long stretches of heat. They help plants pull nutrients steadily instead of struggling every time conditions shift slightly. A plant with deep, healthy roots often looks calmer through summer stress. You notice it especially in late afternoon when weaker plants start drooping and the stronger ones still hold themselves upright. It took me years to notice that pattern consistently. Most gardeners spend more time feeding leaves than feeding root conditions. I definitely did. Garden centers are filled with products aimed upward. Bloom boosters, leaf sprays, fast fertilizers, fruit enhancers, and some of those products absolutely have their place. But very few people talk about building stronger root systems slowly over an entire growing season. That is where things quietly started changing in my own garden. And oddly enough, one of the ingredients that seemed to help the most was sitting in the kitchen the whole time: plain baker's yeast. The first time I heard someone mention using yeast around vegetables, I almost ignored it completely. Honestly, it sounded like one of those old gardening tricks people pass around without ever really testing properly. But the gardener explaining it was not dramatic about it at all. That caught my attention. He did not call it magic. He did not promise giant harvests. He simply said his plants recovered from transplant shock faster and seemed to build thicker root systems over time. That felt believable, especially because experienced gardeners usually speak cautiously when something actually works. So I tried it. Not everywhere, just on a small section of the garden at first, because I did not entirely trust it yet. And for a while, nothing obvious happened. That part matters. A lot of online gardening videos skip directly to dramatic results. Real gardens usually do not work that way. Most meaningful changes happen slowly enough that you almost miss them at first. The early differences were subtle. A transplant stayed firmer during hot afternoons. A pepper plant bounced back quicker after a dry spell. Tomatoes seemed less stressed after heavy rain followed by sudden heat. At first, I honestly thought the season itself might just be cooperating better. Then I started noticing the pattern repeating. Plants treated with the yeast mixture did not necessarily grow wildly bigger overnight. That was never the interesting part. The interesting part was how steady they felt compared to nearby plants: steadier during heat, steadier after transplanting, steadier during inconsistent weather. And if you garden long enough, you learn that resilience matters more than explosive growth. A fast-growing plant can still fail. A resilient plant keeps producing when conditions stop being ideal. That difference changed the way I looked at the whole garden. Around that same time, I started reading more about how roots interact with the life already living in the soil. Not in an overly scientific way, just enough to understand why certain plants seem stronger even when treated almost the same. What surprised me was how long gardeners had noticed these effects before researchers fully explained them. For years, people simply observed that certain homemade ferments and biological mixtures seemed to help root development. Older gardeners noticed seedlings recovering faster. They noticed stronger transplants. They noticed plants holding up better through difficult summers. Most of them could not fully explain why. They just trusted what they kept seeing, season after season. And honestly, gardening has always worked like that to some degree. Observation usually comes first. Explanation arrives later. The plants did not just grow differently, they behaved differently during stress. That part stayed with me. One August afternoon really drove it home. We had several days of heavy humidity followed by dry heat and hard sun. The kind of weather that usually exposes weak roots quickly. Some of my tomato plants looked exhausted by lunchtime, leaves folding inward, growth slowing, soil drying unevenly. But the plants receiving the yeast mixture earlier in the season stayed noticeably more stable. Not perfect, just steadier. The difference was subtle enough that a casual observer might miss it completely. But gardeners notice small things after enough seasons. You notice which plants stop growing after stress and which ones quietly continue. That was when I started paying more attention to what might actually be happening around the roots themselves. Yeast is alive. That matters more than most people realize. Once activated in warm water, those tiny organisms begin feeding, multiplying, and interacting with the environment around them. And while gardeners usually think of yeast only in terms of baking bread, the same living activity can influence the soil around plant roots in surprisingly practical ways. The first thing that interested researchers was root signaling. Certain yeasts naturally produce compounds connected to root development, not in some magical, exaggerated way, more like gentle encouragement for the plant to branch outward and establish itself more aggressively underground. That explains why some transplants seem to settle in faster after application. The second thing involves the soil environment itself. As yeast becomes active, it releases nutrients, amino acids, and other byproducts into the surrounding moisture. The roots are not dealing with raw, dry material anymore. Everything becomes softer, more biologically active, easier for the plant to interact with. That may sound technical, but gardeners actually recognize the result very easily. The soil simply feels more alive afterward. Roots spread differently in living soil compared to dead, compacted ground. And then there was another observation that surprised me even more. Some studies suggested roots are not as passive as we once thought. For a long time, most people pictured roots like drinking straws, simply pulling nutrients upward from wet soil. But roots appear far more interactive than that. They communicate with microorganisms, they respond to nearby biological activity. In some situations, they even pull microscopic life close enough to extract nutrients directly from it. The first time I read about that, I had to stop and reread it twice. Because suddenly, certain garden patterns started making sense. Why compost-rich beds often outperform heavily fertilized beds. Why living soil recovers faster after stress. Why plants sometimes respond better to biological activity than constant feeding from synthetic products alone. And none of this means bottled fertilizers are evil or useless. They absolutely have their place. I still use some myself, depending on the crop and season. But healthy root environments matter far more than I realized earlier in my gardening years. The leaves were only showing part of the story. Underneath the soil, something much more important was happening. Eventually, I started experimenting more carefully with the mixture itself. And this is where a lot of people accidentally ruin the process without realizing it. The recipe is simple, but small details matter. You need warm water, not hot. That was one of my first mistakes. The first batch I ever mixed smelled wrong almost immediately. Sour, flat, no bubbling, nothing active happening at all. I later realized the water had been too hot and killed the yeast before it ever woke up. Now, I always pay attention to temperature first. The water should feel comfortably warm against your wrist, about the same warmth you would use for bread dough. If steam is rising heavily, it is already too hot. I usually fill a glass jar with warm, non-chlorinated water, add a couple spoonfuls of plain baker's yeast, then a small spoonful of sugar to wake everything up. The sugar is not really for the plants. That part gets misunderstood constantly. The sugar feeds the yeast first. It helps the organisms activate and multiply before the mixture ever reaches the soil. Then, I cover the jar loosely with a towel or paper cloth instead of sealing it tightly. That lesson came the hard way too. One early batch built pressure faster than I expected sitting on a warm counter. Thankfully, the lid only leaked instead of cracking the jar completely, but after that, I stopped sealing containers tightly during activation. Little mistakes like that teach you more than instructions sometimes. The mixture usually sits in a dark, quiet spot for around half an hour, sometimes a little longer, if the kitchen is cool. Eventually, a foamy layer forms across the surface, and tiny bubbles rise steadily through the liquid. That is when you know the yeast is active. And honestly, the smell reminds me more of baking bread than gardening, which still feels strange every time I make it. But the real surprise came after I started applying it correctly and consistently at specific moments during the growing season, because timing mattered far more than I expected. At first, I treated the yeast mixture almost like a fertilizer. I assumed more frequent applications would create better results. Looking back, that was not the right approach. The plants did not need constant flooding with the mixture. In fact, too much. seemed to push the soil balance too far in one direction. A couple plants developed overly soft growth one season after I got overly enthusiastic with it. That was another reminder that gardening rarely rewards excess for very long. What finally worked best was using the mixture strategically during moments when the roots were naturally trying to expand. The first timing window is transplanting. That stage matters more than many gardeners realize. The moment a seedling leaves its small container and enters open soil, the plant experiences stress, even if everything appears fine above ground. Some seedlings stall quietly for days after transplanting. Others wilt hard during afternoon heat and never fully recover their early momentum. I used to think that was unavoidable. Now I pay much closer attention to root support during that window. A diluted yeast mixture around freshly transplanted tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, and squash often seems to help them settle in more smoothly. Not instantly, but within the first week, the leaves usually stay firmer during warm afternoons, and the plants begin pushing new growth faster. The strange thing was how long I missed those early signs before connecting them to the roots. The second timing window happens just before flowering begins heavily. That stage is easy to overlook because the plants finally appear healthy and productive again. Most gardeners relax once flowers show up, but underneath the soil, the plant is preparing for a much larger nutrient demand. Weak roots struggle badly at that stage. You often see it later as blossom drop, stalled fruit growth, or plants that suddenly look exhausted halfway through production. A stronger root system helps the plant manage that transition more steadily. Then comes the third application timing. When the first small fruits appear, that was the stage where I noticed some of the clearest long-term differences. Tomatoes stayed more consistent through heat swings. Pepper plants held more fruit without slowing down as dramatically. Cucumbers continued producing longer before stress finally caught up with them. Again, not miracle results. That part matters. Gardening audiences have heard enough exaggerated promises already. Some years, the difference was dramatic. Other seasons, it was simply noticeable. Weather still matters. Soil quality still matters. Sunlight still matters. A healthy garden always depends on many moving pieces working together, but stronger roots quietly improve almost everything else. And for a while, the changes remain easy to miss unless you know what to watch for. The stems gradually thicken, the plants recover faster after heavy rain, leaves stay firmer later into hot afternoons, transplants stop sitting motionless for long stretches. Then eventually, the season reaches that final cleanup stage when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. You pull the plants. That became my favorite part. Not because the season was ending, but because the roots finally told the full story. One autumn evening, after a long, difficult summer, with inconsistent rainfall and several brutal heat waves, I started clearing old tomato vines from the beds. Some plants came out easily with sparse roots hanging underneath like thin strings. Others looked completely different. Dense root masses, thick branching fibers, soil packed tightly around the base. The kind of roots that clearly spent months exploring every inch of ground they could reach. Those were almost always the plants treated with the yeast mixture earlier in the season. That was the moment the whole pattern finally made sense to me. The healthier plants were not just surviving because of what happened above the soil. They survived because underground systems had been quietly built long before the stress arrived. And honestly, that changed the way I garden more than any expensive product ever did. These days, I spend less time chasing rapid top growth and more time thinking about soil structure, moisture consistency, airflow, and root health, because once roots weaken, everything above them becomes fragile too. There are still mistakes, of course. Some batches fail completely if the yeast is old. Very hot water can ruin the activation process before it begins. Applying the mixture during extreme midday heat is usually a bad idea because stressed roots do not respond well when soil temperatures are already too high. And storing leftover diluted mixture too long rarely works well either. Fresh batches always seem more effective than old fermented leftovers sitting around for days. That part took me a while to accept because I hate wasting anything in the garden. But sometimes fresh and simple works better than trying to preserve everything. Different plants respond differently too. Heavy feeding vegetables seem to show the clearest results. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, squash, cucumbers, even corn in some seasons. Strawberries responded surprisingly well during runner growth in my own beds. Leafy greens reacted differently. The biggest benefit there usually showed up early during establishment and transplant recovery rather than later growth. Root crops were more unpredictable for me. Some seasons, carrots seemed stronger early on. Other years, I noticed almost no difference at all. That honesty matters because no garden behaves exactly the same every year, and experienced gardeners know that. Still, there is something deeply satisfying about discovering that a simple pantry ingredient can quietly influence the health of an entire garden. Not because it acts like magic, but because it supports the part of the plant most people ignore until problems finally appear. Sometimes the biggest improvements in gardening happen slowly enough that you almost overlook them. A stronger root system does not usually create instant excitement. You rarely notice it standing in the garden with a watering hose in your hand on an ordinary afternoon. But later, during heat waves, drought stress, transplant shock, and heavy fruit production, those hidden improvements begin revealing themselves little by little. And suddenly, the plants that once struggled every summer start holding steady longer than before. That feels different. It feels calmer, more dependable. These days, whenever I pull a healthy plant at the end of the season and see thick roots packed tightly through dark soil, I no longer think only about fertilizer or watering schedules. I think about everything that happened underneath, long before the harvest arrived. The quiet biological activity, the cooler, deeper moisture, the steady expansion nobody could see from above. That is the part gardening slowly teaches over time. Most real progress begins underground first. If you enjoy practical garden observations like this, and the slower side of learning how plants actually behave through a season, you can always stick around for the next one. There are a few other old garden preparations that seem simple at first, until you see what they quietly change underneath the soil. And honestly, those are often the lessons that stay with you longest.